My name is Ashley Hess. I'm the co-lead of BakerHostetler's automotive mobility industry team, which I helped launch last year. Uh, by practice, I am a corporate and M&A attorney and have worked in the automotive sector for my entire career, and I'm a partner here at BakerHostetler. Today, I am joined by former Congressman Peter Roskam, who leads BakerHostetler's federal policy team. And Peter, I'll give you a second. You can introduce yourself further.
Yeah, Ashley, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this conversation with you. So, I am a veteran of Capitol Hill. I spent 12 years in the United States Congress representing a constituency outside of Chicago. For 10 of those years, I spent time on the Ways and Means Committee, which we're going to end up talking a little bit about today as we focus in on Congress. And I also served in congressional leadership, which means I was active in trying to build roll calls and get support within the House of Representatives for various legislative measures. So there's a lot to talk about today, and we'll get to it. But thanks,
Yeah.
Ashley, for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So let me cover a couple of administrative items. So first of all, the webinar is going to last approximately 30 minutes. We encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A feature of Zoom. And if time permits, we will address those at the end or as they pop up. And in any event, we will respond to all unanswered questions via email after the webinar. In addition to the webinar playback, which will be posted on BakerHostetler's YouTube channel, Peter is going to be my guest on the next episode of Rev Up, our new podcast covering the automotive and mobility industry. And if you are interested in the automotive and mobility sector and the future of the industry, please check out Rev Up, where the rubber meets the law. Links to the podcast can be found on most streaming services and on our website. Again, thank you very much for joining, and we'll jump into it. So Peter, we have a lot of road to cover. I know that in the next half hour. But before we dive in, I do want to frame up this conversation and give some context for our listeners. So I often talk about the industry as the evolving automotive and mobility industry. And what I mean by that is that the industry is undergoing significant transition driven by a number of factors. We have technological advancements impacting the vehicles themselves. The manufacturing processes are changing with advanced manufacturing, robotics, AI, and other factors. We have shifting consumer demands, including developing needs around mobility and how consumers want to manage their mobility needs. People just think about mobility differently. Geopolitics plays a very significant role here. We have evolution in a supply chain, which is incredibly impactful on the industry. And finally, the workforce is changing and specifically shrinking. So in this dynamic, this shifting industry that's facing automakers and suppliers, they also have to deal with an industry that has a multi-year cycle of capital investment, design, securing the supply base, manufacturing, and then selling to customers. That adds complexity. On top of that, as I just referenced, we now add not only a new US president with his political party in control of Congress, but there's really been a real change in the way our country is thinking about its position in the world. And we are going from a place of globalization to more thinking around localization under the Make America Great Again policies that we associate with Trump. So people on this webinar are going to be asking themselves, how do we compete? Where do we invest? What does the industry look like in 5 years? So I want to start at that high level. And last night, my wife and I went to see Les Mis. So I'm going to channel my inner Jean Valjean here and start with kind of, bring him home. And let's talk about where we see manufacturing in America in the next few years and some of the policies that are going to be, impacting manufacturing in America.
Well, so I'm not exactly prisoner 24601, but let me do my best. So you pose an interesting question, and I think, Ashley, one of the things that you've described in all of those iterations of things that the automotive and mobility industry is thinking about is a mosaic of pressures, and all those things changing consumer habits, changes in supply chain, all that litany is incredibly consequential. And then the overlay is obviously a new regulatory regime that can change. So what is manufacturing like? Manufacturing for a while has been largely favored in the US. I mean, there's predispositions in the current tax code that under Section 199A, for example, that give advantages to manufacturers in some settings. And I think that part of what's unique about the auto industry, in particular, auto and mobility, is how deeply embedded it is into the rest of the economy. There's some other sectors that are quite big, and I can't give you chapter and verse. Maybe ag is as big as agriculture is as big as the auto industry, but the auto industry is so inextricably linked to the economic health of the nation. It's no surprise that all of these factors have an impact on it. I am of the view that we're looking at more and more and more sophisticated manufacturing. That's where the percentage is in terms of a higher value proposition. I represented, as I mentioned in the introduction, a constituency outside of Chicago, had a lot of second and third generation manufacturers, and the ones that flourished were the ones who figured out, notwithstanding the global pressure, they figured out how to manufacture, in some cases, 5 times to the right of a decimal, incredibly sophisticated precision manufacturing into the auto industry. So a lot of my constituents were suppliers into into the big auto companies. And so therein lies this juxtaposition of technological change that's moving quickly, the fast adaptation of technology as it relates to an incredibly competitive world marketplace, and then other factors that are regulatory and political that can constrain or create opportunities. So it is a season where there's real change and real opportunity all the way around. And the whole question is, how can an entity, how can viewers now be on the balls of their feet, looking at opportunities and be well poised to take advantage of them, as opposed to being on their heels and just constantly reacting. This manifests itself in the trade questions, the supply line questions, what, in terms of US-China policy that I'm sure we're going to get to in our time today. All of these things are so deeply embedded that we're talking about one of the industries that has so many touch points from a policy point of view.
Yeah, and so let's unpack this a bit. And I think you're approaching this the right way, which is, the people listening to this podcast or webinar today in the podcast, they want to know, how do I position my business for what's coming at us? And so if we start with the first topic, that there is a desire, and I think what you're saying is there has been a desire. It's part of the last couple of administrations. Let's say, Trump 1, Biden is going to be part of Trump 2, that we want more manufacturing in the United States. What are the tools that are going to drive that? In other words, how will Trump and the new Congress achieve that goal? Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so one of the things, there's a couple things to focus on. One is tax policy. One is a regulatory regime, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then the other is trade policy. How do these tariffs manifest themselves? So let's talk quickly about taxes. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act have a number of expiring provisions that are cooked into them for crazy reasons, but they will be expiring at the end of 2025. If Congress does nothing, over $4 trillion in taxes will be imposed on the American public and on American business. That's not going to happen. Congress feels tremendous pressure in revisiting this and taking these things under consideration. But it's not it's not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination, Ashley, what these new tax provisions are going to look like. I was very active in the last bill, but and there's only 5 members of my party who were active on that bill during the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, who are still serving on the Ways and Means Committee.
Yeah,
Said another way,
let me pause you on that point because I think this is an excellent point that doesn't get touched on enough. How many people were involved on the last bill when you were a participant?
so, I mean, let's say for the sake of argument, there's 35 people roughly on the Ways and Means Committee, something in that order of magnitude. And I'm a Republican. There are only 5 Republicans who were participating in that, and that was in 2017, Ashley. So here we are a few years later, and it's entirely new faces. So some of them, some of these proposals will survive that, but some of these members of Congress will say, I'm not so sure about that. I want to make adjustments. And my point is that there will be a number of competing factors that are trying to get the attention of policymakers. The mobility and automotive industry is one of them. Manufacturing is one of them. But that's not the only voice. Okay, let's shift to another trend that's going to be influencing what this market's going to look like. And that is the question about tariffs. Now, President Trump has been arguing, he makes 3 arguments in favor of tariffs. On the one hand, he says this is going to create revenue. On the other hand, he says this will create a reshoring bonanza. And on the other hand, he says this is all kind of a negotiating posture. And if you push each of those to their outer limits, they get interesting. So the notion of revenue raising, well, it's Americans who pay tariffs, and that's not really well understood at this point in the general discussion. And if you're raising tariffs, you're raising a tax, but that really gets obfuscated somewhat during the debate. The reshoring question is an open question. And the desire of companies to reshore in the United States isn't going to be driven completely by tariff policy, but in fairness to the president, that could influence things. And then who knows about the negotiating posture? We see the kind of trolling vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico right now, but he's clearly got a view. Donald Trump is a mercantilist. He has a lower view of sort of the historic free trade position that we've seen in the United States, and a higher view of a mercantilist worldview. You described it a minute ago as localization, and that's exactly it. So this is not the United States alone that's dealing with this, but we're the biggest economy in the world, and so the decisions that get made are incredibly significant. Some of these, go ahead.
Well, what about the argument against tariffs that's going to drive further inflation?
For sure. That's a very robust argument, and I'm persuaded by that. I think that that's not really well discussed, and I think that it's likely to be an accelerant for inflation. And so what's interesting is current law gives the President of the United States very broad authority as it relates to tariffs. It doesn't give him complete authority. And it's been a couple generations, since the US Congress voted to raise tariffs. All the tariff pressure over the past few decades has been removing barriers, free trade agreements with various countries, and so forth. But that's really fundamentally shifted. So the tariff question and an increased interest in tariffs will definitely impact the participants in this industry. The final thing is a regulatory agenda. Now, some of that is executive branch activity. So the President of the United States, over the past several presidents, has in some cases gotten very frustrated with Congress and said, I'm not going to wait for Congress to act. I'm going to issue an executive order. And so we've seen kind of a back and forth. It reached a pretty high point, in my opinion, under President Obama. President Trump followed that. President Biden followed that. Looks like President Trump is going to follow that again. In my estimation, it's not particularly helpful because it just creates a level of uncertainty that if something is dealt with by Congress, the statute is changed. It's more of a stable policy long term. But the back and forth nature of the regulatory approach, I think, is going to favor manufacturing. I think the disposition of the Trump team and the economic disposition of most of these people is to try and lower barriers of entry, get not just American manufacturing at a more aggressive place, but American energy production and some of these other things. So taxes, tariffs, a regulatory environment are all things that I think are going to be impactful. I think the regulatory environment is going to be more favorable. Tariffs is very, very questionable in my view, and the tax policy is likely to be favorable. Those are the things I think, Ashley, that folks need to be thinking about. There's a geopolitical element to this too, which you alluded to in your opening, and that is how should companies be thinking of a massive market, for example, like China? The politics right now has really shifted on China, and it is, the House of Representatives, which is a pretty fraught institution. People are pretty uptight and are at odds with one another. But on the question of China, there is a real bipartisan consensus that China is now perceived to be a strategic opponent of the United States. And in light of that, it begs the question of decoupling. It begs the question of, well, if we move operations from China, where do we go? Do we go to Vietnam? Do we go to Mexico? Do we go to the Philippines? And so forth. And all of these things are really quite compelling, and they can drive business decisions.
Yeah. And before we leave this area, you touch on this with regard to the question about the regulatory environment. And I think what you're saying, but don't let me put words in your mouth, is we are entering an administration that is going to be more business friendly when it comes to things like permitting, mining. Trump has said, drill baby drill with regard to oil and gas, and that permitting function in this country. I mean, that can have a real impact.
Oh, by all means. Yeah, I think you're accurately characterizing the attitude of the leadership of the Trump administration as it relates to permitting, as it relates to just trying to lower barriers of entry to create more economic activity. I mean, I'm of the opinion, Ashley, that Donald Trump views his legacy in a couple of ways. One of which is the restoration of the American economy. You know what I mean? And just getting inflation under control and moving the economy in ways that people have more and more confidence in. And I think him and his team are going to be very, very focused on that. Yes, the border matters. Yes, the Department of Defense matters, all those other things. But I think the economic questions are inextricably linked in the president's own mind to his own legacy.
Yeah, I think that's right. The other areas we could touch on here, antitrust enforcement. I think there's a general view that there would be a more business friendly approach to this. I don't know with regard to CFIUS, the government committee that analyzes the impact of certain foreign investments, but any input on those or anything different than what I just stated?
I think, look, on the Federal Trade Commission, for example, because they've been, under Chairwoman Lena Khan has, I don't think I'm being unkind. It pretty hostile to business and pretty hostile to mergers and acquisitions and looking at those things askance. I think that changes under a new Federal Trade Commission. Just the attitude changes. That's not to say it's a rubber stamp, but it is to say it's going to be just more favorably disposed to these types of things. On CFIUS, I think that there will be an interest on the part, and CFIUS, for those who aren't familiar, is a multi-agency effort to review strategic assets in the United States and whether foreigners can own them. So think ports and other types of infrastructure, things of significance. I think the CFIUS reviews will be fairly robust, actually, because the CFIUS will not want to be manipulated in some way that some malign entity is able to gain control of something. But I don't think they're going to be difficult to the point of being obtuse, but I do think that they're going to be taking a close look at direct foreign investment.
Yeah. Okay, I want to turn next to some of the policies that may impact the EV market, the market for electric vehicles in the United States. There's a whole host of things that we could touch on here, but maybe since we haven't talked as much about the EPA, the environmental side, we start with some of the policies around greenhouse gas emissions and how changes are in the approach there could impact EVs in the United States. I mean, what's going to happen with the EPA under this administration?
Well, the EPA is likely to be led by former Congressman Lee Zeldin, who has the president's ear, has a relationship with him. Lee Zeldin represented, and I served with him, and he's got a good reputation, in my opinion. Served in Congress representing Long Island and ran for governor of New York. So he's been in and around sort of the New York political scene. To describe his worldview, that is Zeldin's, is to describe somebody who is sort of in that traditional free market lane that would say, yes, we've got concerns about greenhouse gases, but we've got a lot of other things to be concerned about too. So I don't think that you're going to see leadership that's just completely dismissive of climate claims, but you're also going to see more of a counterweight in terms of fossil fuels and so forth. So in the same way that the leadership at what I've just described at the FTC will be shifting in terms of disposition, I think that the EPA leadership will be shifting too. And I guess the best way to think about it, we've all interacted with people over the years, and sometimes when you're negotiating with somebody and you're interacting with someone and they're trying to get to yes as opposed to trying to get to no. And I think Zeldin's, and this is just me projecting, but I think Zeldin's attitude on various measures will be, let's try and get to yes. How can we have as much economic activity, good economic activity as possible, at the same time maintaining stewardship of environmental resources? So I think under Zeldin's leadership, you'll see a rebalancing in some ways, because in some ways the EPA, from one perspective, people have been criticizing it, saying, "Listen, it has become obtuse and difficult, and we're arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of the pin, as opposed to figuring out how we should have a good balance between economic activity and these health issues."
Well, and I think what you touch on there that I want to pause on for a second is the EPA is likely to take a more market-driven approach to regulations impacting the automotive industry. And for instance, there was recently granted a waiver for California to have higher standards for zero emissions for cars sold in California by 2035. A rollback of the federal regulations and a move by the Trump EPA to withdraw California's waiver would slow the urgency with which the automotive manufacturers now have to build an electric vehicle fleet and have those on the road by 2035. That's how that approach could impact the automotive industry.
That's right. And it's interesting too to be thinking about, even just more generally, Ashley, rolling back various regulations. So there's there's something called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress and a new administration to review sort of late-breaking rules that have been put in place by the previous administration. So the Trump team would be able to look back, let's say roughly till August of 2024. Anything that was promulgated after that would be subject to the Congressional Review Act. Now, there's a complexity there, though. What is the complexity? The complexity is there's not a lot of Senate floor time to be able to deal with these things. They've got nominations, they've got to deal with the debt ceiling, they've got to deal with these various reconciliation packages, they've got to fund the government. You take my point. The other thing is trying to undo then, if you don't use the Congressional Review Act and you go in and you try and undo it through the normal rulemaking process, that can take a year. I mean, that's a lengthy legal enterprise for any incoming agency to do it and not use that shortcut way through the Congressional Review Act. So my point is that while many of these things, yeah, there's going to be some look backs, but many of these things will be choices that the new administration will be making on a moving forward basis.
Yeah. So since we're talking about EVs, a couple of the questions that have come in have asked about the $7,500 tax credit given to consumers who buy electric vehicles. There's been headlines that we've seen over the last couple of months, whether that's going to be eliminated or not. Any insight there?
I'm of the view that that's under a lot of pressure, and that it is it could very easily be just eliminated moving forward. And the reason is some of these tax questions, Ashley, now will become a zero-sum game. In other words, this tax provision will compete against another one for kind of revenue space. And I don't want to get everybody bogged down in a bunch of procedures, so I will leave it there. But the reason is that this will be in direct competition to other aspects of the tax code.
Yeah. And I think generally speaking, the revocation of the credit is viewed to be most damaging for the traditional automotive manufacturers who will be moving to an electric fleet versus a company that maybe is focused on electric vehicles from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm also hearing here is you're saying, look, that may go away, but there may be something else that comes along to fill that void in terms of an incentive of some sort that would be beneficial.
Exactly, Ashley. And I think toward that end, there's sometimes when policymakers say, I don't want to be choosing technologies here. I don't think that's the role of tax policy. And if we want to incentivize, some threshold here, then fine. That's a good and worthy thing. But let's not be picking technologies, because frankly, Congress isn't very good at picking winners and losers. The marketplace is far, far superior.
Yeah. I also want to touch on the EV supply chain and raw materials. I mean, this is a hot topic area. China has actually implemented restrictions on the export of high-grade graphite. High-grade graphite is moved are used in the production of EV batteries, specifically lithium-ion batteries. And there was just a headline in the newspaper that, yesterday, the day before, that GM just signed a deal with a company from Norway where they're going to get their graphite that's going to be used to produce, GM's EV batteries. So in terms of what's going on, whether it's mining, maybe this touches on the permitting, but also the tit for tat maybe between a country like China that is rich in many of these elements and minerals, and the United States. I mean, what impact is that going to have on the uptake of EVs and the rise of the EVs in the United States?
Will be incredibly significant. So nobody can foreshadow where this ends up. And as you were talking about Norway, the thing that popped into my mind was Greenland. I mean, when President Trump is talking about Greenland, when it first comes up, you think, oh, that's like pretty wild-eyed. But then the more you think about strategic minerals, and I don't have a view into the types of minerals that are there, but we know that they're significant. It begs this larger question. Now, I think the permitting question is going to be a far easier discussion. If you're in the mining business, this is a good week for you. You know what I mean? If you're in the mining business in the United States, it's a good week in terms of just having more support, political support, to be able to explore here. But for purposes of this call, people making decisions, there's many unknowns about how this manifests itself. But I do know this: the pressure on the U.S.-China relationship is not going to be easing up in the foreseeable future. In fact, I think it gets tighter and tighter and tighter.
Okay, well, we're getting close to the half hour, maybe just a tick over. I'm going to end with one last question. I'm going to give you one word only. I want you to react to it. The word is this: DOGE.
DOGE is they've got their work cut out for them in terms of expectations. There's let me if you think of the federal budget pie right now, Ashley, put it in a 2/3, 1/3 piece. 2/3 of the federal budget is nearly off limits. What is that? It's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's Social Security, and it's interest on the debt. The remaining 1/3 is, you got to divide that in half. So 1/6 is the Department of Defense, and the remaining sixth is everything else in the federal government. So for a lot of political reasons, 2/3 of that budget you can't touch, really. Now, there may be some significant savings, as a little bit of a caveat. There may be some significant savings in Medicaid eligibility, for example, but by and large, this Department of Government Efficiency is going to be looking out over the fruited plain. And I think that they have created a very high expectation of the amount of savings that they're going to be able to find. So I wish them well. I think everybody does wish them well. But if they're unable to go into that 2/3 of the budget, the pickings are fairly slim comparatively for the numbers that they're talking about.
Peter Roskam, thank you for being my guest. We'll stop here, and I want to do this again. I want to give this administration and Congress a little time, and I want to come back. I think there's more ground to cover, and I want to see what you think about the first 100 days.
Actually, great to be with you.